By 1920, women had won the right to vote and run for political office in almost all of the Western world. Polling stations were finally open to them in Britain, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, and most of Northern Europe. But not in Newfoundland. Local suffragists still had another 5 years of work ahead of them. Some had already put in about 30. Newfoundland's first suffrage campaign dates back to the fall of 1890. A group of about 60 St. John's women formed a local branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The WCTU was an international organization that wanted voting rights for women. The suffrage movement quickly gained momentum in Newfoundland. It attracted influential leaders like Lady Jeanette Thorburn and Emma Peters. Both were gifted public speakers who had ties to the political and mercantile elite. Soon, WCTU branches opened at other communities across the island, and a suffragist newspaper called the Water Lily began to circulate. There was also a public demonstration in St. John's. On March 18, 1891, suffragists marched from the old Temperance Hall on Duckworth Street to the Colonial Building. They handed the government a stack of petitions from all across the island demanding that women be allowed to vote. But not in every election, just in those that dealt with local issues, like whether or not alcohol should be allowed in a specific jurisdiction. But even these modest demands proved too controversial for the time. Prime Minister William Whiteway opposed the movement, and so did most of his government. The Evening Telegram also came out against suffrage.
We have no word of sympathy or encouragement for those ladies who would voluntarily unsex themselves, and for the sake of obtaining a little temporary notoriety, plunge right into the troubled waters of party politics. We say, with all reverence and humility, from the tear of such strong-minded lady agitators, good Lord deliver us.
Bonavista MHA Donald Morrison introduced a suffrage bill in 1892, but the legislature defeated it by a vote of 13 to 10. The same thing happened 1 year later. The Water Lily published the names of every man who voted against suffrage. Its editor, Jesse Oman, wrote that they should not be elected to office again.
A legislature composed of such narrow-minded men must be ousted. We ask the women of Newfoundland to use all the power they possess in influencing their husbands, sons, and fathers to refuse to vote at the next election for any of the gentlemen who voted against women's suffrage.
But with the government and the mainstream press firmly against women's suffrage, the movement lost its momentum. Defeated, WCTU members shifted their attention to charitable and missionary work. But the topic did not entirely disappear. Suffragists were still fighting in other parts of the world. There was a victory in New Zealand in 1893, followed by Australia in 1902 and Finland in 1907. Suffragists were also demonstrating in Britain and Canada and the United States. All of this made its way into Newfoundland newspapers. Soon, local clubs and societies began to debate suffrage. But there was a problem. Most clubs were for men only. Women were banned from membership and from the discussion. Armine Gosling decided to change that. In 1909, she and a small group of women founded the Ladies' Reading Room in downtown St. John's. Within its walls, women read international newspapers and magazines. They debated current affairs and became skilled public speakers. The Reading Room had politicized a new generation of women who would lead the suffrage movement. But before any significant gains were made, the world went to war. The suffrage movement was scaled down as Newfoundland and Labrador women answered the call to duty. Some served overseas as nurses and ambulance drivers. Thousands more stayed home and joined the Women's Patriotic Association. They raised huge amounts of money that proved vital to the war effort. Volunteers shipped desperately needed medical supplies and food to the front lines, and they knitted scarves, sweaters, and socks for troops overseas. When the war was over, women in Newfoundland and Labrador had contributed $500,000. That's worth about $6.5 million today. The war had proved that women's traditional work, such as fundraising and knitting and caregiving, was of tremendous social and economic importance. Suffragists now had a powerful argument for the vote. If women contributed so much to society, shouldn't they also have a say in its governance? Armine Gosling spearheaded a reinvigorated suffrage movement. She was joined by other leaders. like Myra Campbell and Agnes Eyre. There was also Fanny McNeil. She was a charismatic and persuasive public speaker. Her husband, Hector, was also a strong supporter of the suffrage movement. Inside their home in downtown St. John's, the Women's Franchise League formed in 1920. League members immediately launched a publicity campaign. They wrote to newspapers, screened advertisements at local movie houses, and they canvassed homes and businesses. Letter after letter was sent to the government, prodding it to pass a suffrage bill.
To the Honourable R.A. Squires, Prime Minister of Newfoundland. Sir, the promoters of the women's suffrage movement beg to draw the attention of the Premier to the incomprehensible attitude of the government towards the question of the enfranchisement of women, as evidenced in the failure of the two government members to table the bill after having definitely pledged themselves to do so.
To the Honourable R.A. Squires, Prime Minister of Newfoundland. Dear Sir, the undersigned women residents of the district of St. John's West, who are deeply interested in the movement for women's suffrage, earnestly request that you will kindly give the measure your support when it comes before the House.
On May 4th, 1921, League members gathered at the Colonial Building. They handed the government a petition. 10,000 signatures called for women to have the vote. Support came from other quarters, too. The same mainstream press that had opposed suffrage in the 1890s now endorsed it. But there was a different attitude in the House of Assembly. Prime Minister Sir Richard Squires was firmly against women's suffrage. So were many of the politicians in his party. When the legislature debated a franchise bill in 1921, it was defeated by a vote of 13-9. Still, there was a bit of success that year when the city of St. John's granted women the municipal vote. 3 women ran for council in the next election. None won a seat, but they had respectable showings. Julia Salter Earle came within 11 votes of victory. All the while, the Franchise League continued to push for women's suffrage. By 1925, there was reason for optimism. Richard Squires was no longer in office. Walter Munro was the new Prime Minister. He was sympathetic to the suffragist cause, and so was his cabinet. League members lobbied Munro for support, and on March 9, 1925, the Prime Minister himself introduced a suffrage bill to the legislature. It passed unanimously that same day and became law in April. 90% of women voters turned out for the first general election on October 29, 1928. 2 years later, the first woman was elected to the House of Assembly in a by-election. Ironically, it was Lady Helena Squires, the wife of Sir Richard Squires. The Women's Franchise League continued to exist, but under a new name, the League of Women Voters. The courageous work done by suffragist leaders like Fanny McNeil and Armine Gosling would live on to benefit all future generations of Newfoundland women.